Afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. I feel like I should be saying good evening with how dark it is out, but it's still afternoon, I guess. Welcome to Providence College, those of you coming from outside the gates. My name is Arthur Urbano. I am a professor in the theology department here at the college, and I'm also chair of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee. And I'd like to welcome you to our fall semester installment of our series, Theological Exchange Between Catholics and Jews. Now in its 7th year, the series seeks to promote interreligious understanding and dialogue by focusing on themes of mutual religious and theological interest in the Catholic and Jewish traditions. It's an opportunity for Catholics and Jews to learn about and from one another. Our events for this academic year are part of the second of a 3-year series commemorating Nostra Aetate. October 28, 2015 marked the 50th anniversary of this groundbreaking document, which was issued by the Second Vatican Council. Nostra Aetate in Latin means in our age, and it's from the first words of the document. And in English, the document is called the Declaration on the Relation of the Church to Non-Christian Religions. And the document articulated a new vision of the Catholic Church's relationship to Judaism, Islam, and other world religions, and opened the door wide to interreligious dialogue. Nostra Aetate was especially revolutionary in the way it reoriented the Christian-Jewish relationship. It affirmed the Jewish roots of Christianity, the enduring covenant relationship between God and the Jewish people. It condemned anti-Semitism and rejected the age-old charge that the Jews were collectively responsible for the crucifixion of Jesus. And it called for collaboration, dialogue, and joint study. The anniversary of Nostra Aetate has been marked across the world by celebrations, conferences, and prayer. In his comments on the anniversary, Pope Francis said, and I quote, "Special gratitude is owed to God for the true and proper transformation of the relation in these 50 years between Christians and Jews. Indifference and opposition have changed into collaboration and benevolence. From enemies and strangers, we have become friends and brothers." He went on to say, "Dialogue based on trustful respect can bring seeds of good that in turn become shoots of friendship and collaboration in so many fields." This year's events, including our spring semester, our spring semester dialogue, which will take place on April 4th, focus on the significance and impact of Nostra Aetate to the present time. The events in our 3rd year, next year, will look at the future of interreligious dialogue. And we are pleased to have as our guest next year Cardinal Timothy Dolan, Archbishop of New York and co-chair of the National Jewish Catholic Dialogue. Cardinal Dolan will be here at Providence College on November 3rd, 2016, so mark your calendars if you're filling it up now. Special acknowledgement and thanks is owed to our donors and co-sponsors who make these events possible. Among these are the Diocese of Providence, Edward and Barbara Feldstein, Arthur Robbins, Leo Magavero, James Winokur, and other alumni and friends of the college, and special thanks also to the Center for Catholic and Dominican Studies, who is co-sponsoring tonight's event. This event itself is really the fruit of Jewish-Christian cooperation and collaboration. It's now my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker. And since Rabbi Bemporad will be talking a lot about his experience and activities, I won't steal his thunder and give you the whole list of things he's done at this point, so I'll keep my introduction short. Rabbi Jack Bemporad is the director of the Center for Interreligious Understanding in Teaneck, New Jersey. Founded in 1992, the center promotes open dialogue, mutual respect, and theological understanding among people of all faiths. He's also director of the John Paul II Center for Interreligious Dialogue and professor of interreligious studies at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum in Rome, which is administered by the Dominican Order. Rabbi Bemporad is a native of Italy and fled with his family to the U.S. prior to World War II. He studied philosophy at Tulane University and Hebrew Union College. He was also the first rabbi to receive a Fulbright scholarship. Over the past 40-plus years, Rabbi Bemporad has dedicated his life's work to promoting and fostering understanding and reconciliation among the world's different faiths, a calling that requires great faith, persistence, trust, and as the Italians would say, pazienza, patience. He has met with popes and has led groups of Muslim leaders on study tours to the Dachau and Auschwitz concentration camps. This is Rabbi Bemporad's second time here at Providence College. He visited back in 2009 when we were first getting this program off the ground. So it's a great pleasure after about seven seasons of our program to have him back and to be able to show him the fruits of our labor. So it's my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Jack Bemporad.
Thank you very much, Arthur. This is a real joy for me to be back here. And it's especially a joy because for the last 18 years I've been teaching in Rome in a Dominican university. So to be here, it really is a pleasure. And the reception that I've had so far has just been wonderful. And I thank you for inviting me. Let me say quite clearly that my own involvement in Jewish-Christian dialogue has a lot to do with the fact that I came here not quite at the age of 6 as a result of the racial laws in Italy. Those laws were pretty bad. In fact, they were so bad that when I went to school, they told me that I couldn't go to school because I was Jewish. And that I had to literally, the principal called my mother and said, you have to come and pick up your son. And I thought being Jewish meant being sick, because the only other time I had to go home was when I was sick, you see. But I must tell you that it really left a kind of a scar in all of our lives. I don't think that my parents ever got over having to leave Italy. My father was a very wealthy and a very successful businessman, and my brother was just months, maybe 9, 10 months old when we left, and it was a hard experience coming here. So you can imagine what happened when I had a Fulbright to the University of Rome, that I was called by the president of my organization, Eisendrath, Rabbi Eisendrath, that I should go as the only Jewish representative to an audience with Pope John the 23rd. I must tell you that I went to that audience with a great deal of trepidation. I had for years studied at the Hebrew Union College, and I was on the academic track. So I did a lot of work. Plus, for 3 years, I was the assistant to the professor of history. And so I did a lot of the research that had to do with a good deal of information with respect to Catholic attitudes towards Jews. And not just Catholic, but also Protestant and others. And so I was very, very aware of the kind of teachings that the Catholics and others presented with respect to Jews. And even though I basically studied, Bible and all the rest, that impressed me as being something that I felt very concerned about. So when I was asked to go and have an audience with John the 23rd, I felt like, well, do I really want to do it? And, I'm sort of going into, I really felt I was going into enemy territory, you see? Well, and by the way, I don't know how many of you have had a private audience with a pope. I've had 8 audiences with John Paul II and 3 with Benedict. So I can tell you that in those days, it was a very different experience. First of all, you had to go from one room to another room to a third room. It was hours before you were able to get. And the Pope was brought in on a throne. It was a very different experience. And he started speaking. He spoke in French. And there was maybe 15 people there. And he started speaking about the whole issue of the conference was the Battle Against Hunger campaign. And he started talking about hunger and suffering and the agony of human beings. And as he started talking, he started crying. I couldn't believe it. I had a feeling this was a genuinely caring, loving, decent human being. this was not the Catholic that I had read about. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's almost like here I had this experience of a pope, not just a priest or a bishop, but a pope who was absolutely saintly. And I had a kind of a problem with that, because that was not what I had expected. And afterwards, he did go and he shook everybody's hand, and he happened to recognize my name, Bemporad, because he had known my uncle. And so it was a kind of a link that really was a very big. But later I discovered that he was literally tortured by the suffering of the Jews, and especially what happened during the Holocaust. This was something that so pained him, where he had such concerns about it, that I was convinced when I left, and I had an audience with him in '59, that something would take place. It was only later, when in 1960, in June of 1960, that Jules Isaac actually had an audience with him and presented to him the points that he had made before. Points, incidentally, that he had also given to Pius XII. Pius XII told him in his personal audience with Jules Isaac that he would read them. And he may have read them, but nothing happened. But what happened was, when he met with Jules Isaac, and Jules Isaac said to him quite simply this. He said, look, he said, what you have done is basically disassociated Jesus from Judaism. That's not right. Jesus was a Jew. Mary was a Jew. All of the disciples of Jesus were Jewish. The teachings of Jesus are Jewish teachings. Why is it that you are presenting Jesus not as a Jew killed by the Romans, but as some kind of a pagan killed by the Jews? That just isn't right. You can't do that. And then over the years, and he was a historian. Jules Isaac was a first-class historian. His wife and many of his children were killed. He says, if you look at the kind of things that the Catholic Church has been teaching about Jews and Judaism, you literally are teaching a contempt. And he even wrote a book called The Teaching of Contempt, which is a very interesting book. Well, John the 23rd responded profoundly to that audience. He said, you have every reason to hope, but more than hope, because I will do something. That's what he said to Jules Isaac. And he said to Isaac, I want you to meet Cardinal Bea. Now, here's a whole other story. Cardinal Bea was an Old Testament man who had actually done a lot of work in the Hebrew prophets and things of that nature. And when he met Jules Isaac, he immediately understood what Isaac was talking about. And what is most interesting is that when Jules Isaac left his meeting with Bea, he got up and he said to the people that were with him, he said, finally, I have met a cardinal who understands the tribulations, the agonies, and the sufferings of the Jewish people. And Cardinal Bea was given, actually, the task of doing something about it, which led to Vatican II, which is essentially what we're now celebrating the 50th anniversary of. But that combination of Jules Isaac, Pope John the 23rd, and Cardinal Bea was an incredible combination of understanding, not a combination of misunderstanding, not a combination of non-dialogue. It's a combination of intense, profound understanding and mutual trust. So that really brought about a revolution. Now keep in mind that Jewish-Christian dialogues in the past have been asymmetrical. What do I mean by asymmetrical? What I mean is, whenever you had a meeting, it was what was called, quote-unquote, a disputation, where literally a rabbi was usually dragged out to defend Judaism before a court that was contrived. And so there's always this sense on the part of the Jews, well, what are we really doing? I mean, what's happening, this so-called dialogue? Can we really trust the Christians to genuinely change when for 2,000 years they haven't? That's the question that arose in the mind. I must tell you in all honesty that when I was teaching at the Hebrew Union College, and when this the Declaration Nostra Aetate came out, and I was speaking to the faculty. I mean, I was on the faculty. I was teaching Jewish philosophy at the Hebrew Union College in New York. And most of my colleagues said, none of it is true. It's all talk. Nothing's happening. In fact, the Orthodox boycotted it. John the 23rd had invited Jewish community to come and be observers. They refused. And it's interesting because John the 23rd sat with the observers. He sat with the observers during the proceedings of Vatican II. And I, in New York, with the faculty, with the people that I was teaching with, they didn't believe any of it. Because they felt there's no way of overcoming this kind of background. Now, in the many years that I have worked in Jewish-Christian relations, I've come to the conclusion that actually there are three questions that one has to ask and answer if we're going to actually get anything done in this whole project. The first question is, how can I be true to my faith without being false to yours? Now, why do I ask that? The reason I ask that is because in the past, usually what happened was you took the best of your faith and compared it to the worst of the other. We believe in the God of love. You believe in the God of wrath, right? We are universal. You are particular, you see. We believe in a universal religion for everyone. You believe only in a national ethnic religion. Well, none of that is true, you see. None of that is true. And so the first question you have to ask is not just how can I be true to my faith, and that is be honest with myself about what it is that I believe. Just recently I was asked to speak at an iftar dinner at the home of the ambassador from Pakistan in Washington, D.C. And I said this. I said in the past, we've been asking questions, how can I be true to my faith without being false to yours? And in fact, what we've done is we've taken the best of us and we've compared it to the worst in the other without asking, do you recognize yourself in my representation? Unless they recognize themselves in my representation, there's no way that we're going to have any dialogue. But what I said to them is, what we've got to do now, and I'll say a few things about this later, we've got to take the best in our religion and compare it to the worst in our religion. Each one of us has elements in our religion which should be changed, which should be modified, which should be looked at. And perhaps that's what we should be doing now. We should take the best in our tradition, the nobility of our tradition, and look at those elements in our tradition that needs literally to be addressed. Now, why is that? Because that's exactly what Vatican II was all about. Vatican II didn't say, look at how wonderful we are, and we're going to look at how wonderful we've been. Vatican II says, in looking at our past, we've discovered that there are things that we have taught that have to be changed. That's a very important thing. See, it's not enough for me to just say, I have to put myself in your shoes. I can do that. I have to go the next step. And what is that next step? The next step is, with what eyes do you see me? How do I really understand you unless I know how you look at me? Unless I know how you categorize me, how you integrate me into your own experience, you see? So literally what we've got to do is find ways of being true to our faith. By the way, at the very beginning, I was involved in the very beginning of this. At the very beginning, you had dialogue that was not dialogue. Let me tell you why it was not dialogue. For two reasons. The first reason is everybody wanted to be nice. So since everyone wanted to be nice, if there was anything that could in any way have been understood in a way that was prejudicial to the others, you avoided it. You avoided it. You didn't discuss it. You were only talking about things that were nice. Well, that's okay. It's like having a meal and only eating the dessert. I mean, I'm sorry, that just doesn't work, okay? So you have to be true. One of the things that I loved about John Paul II, in his first meeting with the Jewish community, he says, look, I know that you want us to understand you and to represent you as you truly are. That's what John Paul II said. And they all quote that. But he also added something which, unfortunately, many people don't quote. And we also expect you to understand us in the way in which we truly are. It's not enough for us Christians to understand Jews. Don't you think it's about time for Jews to have a proper understanding of us? That's basically what he said. There's a great deal of truth to that. So I can only say that the first question is not just how do I represent my faith correctly, and how do you represent your faith correctly, but how do we really understand one another so that we can go to the next step, which is the second question. And that question basically is, how do I represent you, or what place do I have for you in my self-understanding? In other words, what space do I give you? Within what context must Jews see Christians? How do I look at you? Where do I place you? Now, the good thing, at least within the Jewish tradition, is that we have a great number of sayings and teachings that make it somewhat easy for us to do that. For example, the Tosefta, which is an ancient Jewish text, says, the righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come. You don't have to be Jewish to be saved. And to say that a righteous person can gain immortality is exactly, by the way, what the new Universal Catechism says. The new Universal Catechism, which, by the way, was another great innovation of John Paul II. Why did John Paul II go to the synagogue? Why do you think he did the Universal Catechism? Because it wasn't enough to have these documents and put them in some library somewhere, so that if people wanted to look them up, they can look them up. He wanted to publicize these teachings so that everyone would be aware of it. I mean, I can tell you that by actually having a universal catechism, and that universal catechism has all of these teachings put into it, made a tremendous difference. It was translated in over 80 languages. I remember going to Croatia, and I was in Split, and I met the head of the Jewish community there. I went to the synagogue, and he gave me this book in Croatian. I didn't understand it. There was a dedication in it. I opened it up. I said, "What is this?" He says, "The bishop gave it to me, and this gives me hope." Now, this is a man who had been in the Holocaust in a concentration camp in Italy. Okay. And I said, "What is it, and why did it give you hope?" He says, "It's the new catechism, and it gives me hope because of the teachings that it has about the Jews." It's not enough to just have some teaching and put it in a library. You have to be able to put it in a form where people can really read it, understand it, and where bishops can, in fact, act on it. I'll tell you another interesting thing. When the Pope went to should I repeat what I said this afternoon? You know, the Pope was invited, John Paul II, to go into the synagogue. Okay, I have two stories about this, okay? So he was invited to go into the synagogue, and Rabbi Toaf said, "Well, look, you're coming into a synagogue, and, you know, a synagogue, it's a Jewish place, it's Jewish holiness, and so you're not going to wear a cross, are you? I mean, you don't wear a cross in a synagogue, you know." So the Pope said the following. I asked the class this afternoon, how would you respond to that? If you were the Pope and you were going into the synagogue and they told you, "Look, you're not going to wear a cross," I said, here's what the Pope said. He said, "Look, if you want me to come as an ordinary person and sit in a pew, I'll be happy to do that. Then you can do whatever you want. But," he said, "if you want me to come as Pope, and if you want me to state the Jewish position, especially since Vatican II on Jews and Judaism, and our reaching out to you as brothers, how can I come without a cross?" And lo and behold, he came to the synagogue with a cross. Okay, he went to the synagogue. It revolutionized. It was on the front page everywhere. In fact, shortly after that, I happened to be having dinner with the president of my congregation, and her brother was there. And he said, a very strange thing happened, really a strange thing happened. He says, I got in the mail a chemistry set for a 10-year-old, a chemistry set. I'm 65, and I noticed that it came from my mother. The mother was 90. He couldn't believe it. He thought, well, did she go crazy or she become senile? So he called her, Mom, he said. This chemistry set, you sent me this chemistry. I sure did, she said. What would I be doing with a 10-year-old chemistry set for a 10-year-old? She says, do you remember what your father said when you wanted a chemistry set when you were a young boy? He says, look, I remember that I wanted it, and I remember that I didn't get it. But I don't remember what my father said. He says, your father said, when the Pope goes to shul, I'll send you a chemistry set. so the Pope went to shul, and lo and behold, he gets a chemistry set. It shows you the kind of miracles that John Paul II brought about. This man got a chemistry set, So I think that what you've got here is an amazing development, and what actually it did is it actually gave a way in which Jews and Christians can talk to one another very productively, which leads to the third question that I felt we have to deal with. Not just what place do you have for me? And here I think the Catholic Church has definitely made a change. And let me indicate what that change is. It's from a superseded, fossilized, dead Judaism to a living, thriving Judaism that is alive and active. There's no question about that. And what you have today is the respect. I'll give you one or two examples of that. Let me give you one example which is really amazing. The Commission on Biblical Studies came out with a biblical document called The Jewish People and Their Sacred Scriptures in the New Testament. Okay? Now, what that text says is the following. And by the way, Cardinal Ratzinger wrote the introduction to that. It said three things that are very interesting. The first thing it said is that the Jews, in anticipating and expecting their Messiah, help us wait for the return of the Messiah. They teach us in that sense. That's the first thing. The second thing they said, which is very interesting, they said that the Jews have every right to interpret their Bible in a way that is perfectly legitimate for them, even though it may disagree from the way in which we understand the text. Now, I consider that to be an amazing statement, because what that biblical text does is it says simply this: we can learn a lot from the way you interpret your religion. Now, why is this important? Let me be as blunt as I can. It's important because if you really believe that all Jews should be converted to Christianity, that Judaism should cease, what you're really saying is that all of the studies, all of the interpretations, all of the ways in which Jews derive tremendous sustenance, tremendous wisdom, tremendous inspiration from these texts should cease? Can we really say that Jews should cease to exist? Would it really make such a difference if the 15 million Jews in the world would cease to be Jews, and then they're studying, they're meeting together, they're learning, they're understanding, and the kind of wisdom that they've had over thousands of years developed from the study of these texts, that should stop? Here, I must say that the Catholics fully understand that can't happen. And how do they say that it can't happen? It can't happen because we can learn, they say. And keep in mind, Cardinal Ratzinger said that in his introduction, quoting it. We can learn from how you have interpreted these texts. And so they may be different from the way we interpret these texts. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn something from you. Well, if you can have this mutual learning, then there is a space for you. What space is there for you? The space that I have for you is that you are someone that has a rich heritage, a noble heritage, a meaningful heritage, and it's a heritage that I can learn something from. By the way, I must add, because since I started really in 1960 teaching, so that's a long time, isn't it? And when I started teaching Jewish philosophy, the first thing I learned was that you can't do Jewish philosophy without doing Muslim philosophy. You can't really do Maimonides or Sadja or even Halevi. Halevi was tremendously influenced by Al-Ghazali. And you have, for example, Maimonides being tremendously influenced by Al-Farabi and Avicenna and so forth. Sadja was very much influenced by the Mutakalliman, which was the Muslim philosophy. But when I started teaching Maimonides, I realized the tremendous influence that Maimonides had on Aquinas. The tremendous influence. And you know what the interesting thing was? I mentioned this afternoon. When I started reading Aquinas, I learned something about Maimonides. Guess why? He understood Maimonides in some respects much better than I did. Do you understand that? In other words, what Aquinas was doing, he was reading Maimonides. He was interpreting Maimonides. He always spoke about Rabbi Moses. He mentions him over and over again. And then he quotes, and then I saw where he differed from Maimonides, but in describing Maimonides, he made it clearer than I could find it in Maimonides. So it's not true that we can't learn from one another. We can learn from one another. And so the place that you have for the other simply is this, that we can work together so that there's a kind of a mutual enrichment. Vatican II made that possible. Without Vatican II, that would have been impossible. The third thing I think we should ask and answer, this is the third question, and that is, how can we work together for a common good? I mentioned this afternoon that I had gone to Denver when the Pope spoke in Denver, and it was very late. He got going at 5 in the morning. It was 11 o'clock at night, and he said the following. He said, look, I don't think that Jews are ever going to accept the theology of Christians, nor do I think Christians are going to accept the theology of Jews. There's a fundamental difference in the theological foundations of both religions. In other words, there's a real difference between monotheism and Trinitarianism. There's a real difference between accepting, for example, Jesus as a teacher, which is the way Jews mainly would accept it, and thinking Jesus as the Messiah or as the second person of the Trinity. These are issues that we can discuss and learn from one another and try to even understand these things historically. But, he said, you cannot read the prophets. You cannot read the scriptures. And here it's not just limited to the Hebrew Bible. You cannot read the scriptures without understanding the ethics, the ethical foundation in these texts. It's these ethical statements, it's these ethical scriptures that are foundation of our civilization. We have to work together, he said, so that we can develop an objective and universal ethic based on our common traditions, so that through these common traditions, we can do something that's very interesting. We are asked to be a blessing, he said. After all, that's what Abraham stood for. What is it that Abraham was told to be? He was told to leave all the environment of which he was a part, and that he should be a blessing, so that all the world should be blessed through Abraham. And he said, perhaps the best way for us to begin is to be a blessing to one another. To be a blessing to one another. We have to work together in such a way that we can indeed be a blessing to one another. Now, I really think, if I were to summarize in one sentence, what is the essence of Vatican II? That it has taught us, because no other religion has done this. Let's be clear. No other religion has looked into its past and asked, how do we change it so that we do something to help humanity and to properly understand one another? And all that's been built on that. We have something that's precious. We have something that is enormously important. Let us do our best to preserve it, maintain it, recognize it, respect it, and let it be a blessing to the world. Now, in conclusion, because I've already spoken 40 minutes almost, let me say this. With the kind of threat that we're facing with ISIS and with the Islamic State, with the kind of barbarism, it's not a clash of civilizations. That's not a civilization. That's barbarism. If any time is needed for us to reaffirm the real ethical, religious, and spiritual foundations of Judaism and Christianity, now is the time. And so in celebrating Vatican II, in celebrating all of these magnificent statements and documents, I think we can begin to try to offer an alternative that will make sense for us, and not just for us. As the book of Deuteronomy said, I've set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Choose life so that you and your children may live. It has to be a blessing for our children also. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Bemporad. We have some time for questions. There are microphones on either side. I can go around and pass it around. So, yeah.
Rabbi, 2 weeks ago I returned from Spain on a 2-week vacation, and I had a wonderful thing happen, and I wanted to explain it to you.
Please.
There's a grand cathedral in Madrid, which is being rebuilt, I might say, by a Japanese contractor. And I entered the cathedral with armed guards, not for me, but because of the world that we live in. And I'm standing, and there's a woman with a small child next to her, and she looks up at the crucifix, and it's a magnificent crucifix, and there's a whole bunch of bronze plaques with all different languages. And there was one shiny one with Hebrew. And the child says to his mommy, "What's that language?" And she said, "That's Hebrew." And you know Jesus was a Jew. And this was in Madrid. And we all understand what happened in Spain a number of years ago. So I will tell you, keep it up. God bless you. This is wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. One of my younger colleagues has said on a number of occasions, the alternative to bad religion is not no religion. The alternative to bad religion is good religion. And you said in your talk that we all have to look into our own religions and try to bring out the best and get rid of the worst. I think we can all agree with that. The problem is, how do you go about figuring out what is the best in your religion and what is the worst when various segments of the religious body which we represent would answer those questions in very different ways?
Oh, is that a question? I was agreeing with you. Well, I think that there are certain things that could be done. Let me just give you an example of a conference that we sponsored in New York some time back. And in fact, I'm leaving tomorrow to go to the sequel to that conference, and the topic was Between Past and Future, Law and Ethics in Judaism and Islam, which was an attempt to compare halakha with Sharia. And one of the things that I've been doing a good deal of is work with the Muslims these last 15 years, because this, I think, is an absolutely essential task. Unless you can fortify those Muslims and those imams that are really wanting to do the right thing. I just spent 3 days in Kosovo working with the Muslim community there. They're very eager to go against ISIS and all that, okay? Anyhow, here's the interesting thing. We had one woman, Judy Hauptmann, who is a professor of Talmud at JTS, first woman that ever got a PhD in Talmud, okay? Now, what's very interesting is that she's been identified as one of these feminists and so forth, which is and isn't true, okay? But she gave a talk, and here's the amazing thing. She said, there are so many places in the Talmud that are very, very good on women's issues, but nobody pays any attention to them. And so what she did is she actually listed them, explained them, classified them. By the time we got through, we said, is that really the Talmud? You know, because it was so different than the standard interpretations that you get in terms of certain halachic. Now, here's an expert in halakha. She was the first woman when she was distinguished in Talmud, right? You may know who she is, right? Yeah. And so she made all. Now that was Judy Hauptmann. Then we had Aziza, right? Aziza, who is head of this Karama Center for Muslim Studies, and she said, "Now I'm going to mention hadiths that nobody knows about." And she started listing the hadiths, which were statements of the Prophet Muhammad, which nobody pays any attention to, which in fact were very, very positive when it came to women's issues. So now there are different ways of doing it. For example, the way I have in the past tried to do it is to say simply, look, there are certain things in the Jewish tradition, like the whole idea of women being chained, which means that they can't really get a divorce or things of that nature, or we should change the liturgy and so forth. But what Judy Hauptmann was doing is something that in some respects is perhaps more important, and that he says, oh, let's leave that alone. Let's now take all those elements within our tradition that have actually been very positive with respect to women. Let's start with where we've been teaching things that would give us a recognition of women. You see what I'm saying? Now, I think that there's a lot of that could be done. We could actually, and if we do that, then we can go to the Orthodox and say, look, this is in the Talmud. We're not making this up. We're not inventing it. And by showing that it is part of the tradition, it's a way of bringing about some change. Now, I think that that's one step that we can do. Another thing that we can do, and here I think interreligious dialogue is very important. For example, I was at a conference in Italy where we were with some Muslims, and we were talking, and the Muslims were saying, well, here's what we would do. And they were offering suggestions. And I must say that some of the rabbis there said, you know, that had never occurred to us. In other words, their way of interpreting halacha, namely Sharia, gave us some insight in the way we should interpret halacha. So it isn't that our hermeneutic principles have exhausted the field of interpretations, right? And so what I thought we could do through these dialogues is learn from one another how we've addressed these questions and find ways of addressing them in a somewhat better way. I thought that was not bad. Because what it does is it doesn't really confront the Orthodox, I would say, frontally. It confronts the issue by saying, okay, we will grant that what you take as a given, as sacred, as authoritative, we're going to be looking at that very same thing with somewhat different eyes. How's that? Okay, good. You have a response? Well, great, thanks. Anyone else?
Rabbi, having lived through the Holocaust and having lost family in the Holocaust, it remains a deep dig.
Yeah.
And when I see the resurgence of anti-Semitism in Europe, it's like, how long has it been? And here we are again. And it's very frightening. And Pope Francis recently said, he remarked on anti-Semitism rearing its ugly head in Europe. And he also said, much to my surprise, that if you are anti-Israel, you are anti-Semitic. Yet, the good Reverend Tutu runs all around Africa bashing the state of Israel.
Yeah.
How do you
Yeah.
how do you trickle down the Abragamu, the story of the Passion Play? To me, in my mind, why is it still running? It's one of the, to me, because that's all I know. It's one of the deepest, most painful stories ever written, loaded with misconceptions, and yet they run cruises for people to line up and go to see the Passion Play. You can't walk out from the Passion Play loving the Jews. How do you deal with this?
Yeah. Now, you asked at least 3 questions. And let me take them one by one, okay? I think that in my experience, what I have seen is where the Catholic Church, and especially Catholic leadership, has stood up over and over and over again, not just by making a statement, but by actually in conferences and in meetings saying, look, we have full diplomatic relations with Israel, and as a result of these full diplomatic relations, we will not tolerate what you're saying. There was one instance in a conference in Thessalonica where we had some representatives of the PLO there, the Palestinian Liberation. This goes back many years. And one of them got up and said some really atrocious things about Israel. Not that you couldn't criticize Israel. That's not the point. It's one thing to criticize Israel. It's another thing to say it has no right to exist, right? Okay. And Cardinal Cassidy, God bless him, one of the great cardinals, one of the unsung heroes of Vatican II. He's the one that came out with the We Remember document. I mean, he was just outstanding, okay? He says, I'm sorry, if you want to continue to talk like that, the Catholic Church is pulling out of this meeting. And they shut up. We had a big conference in Rome. We had the same, I wrote the agreement. It was the Prague, it was Sacred Spaces, okay? And we had another person get up saying the most atrocious things. At that time, it was McCarrick. Cardinal McCarrick got up and he said, look, we have full diplomatic relations. We are closely akin with Israel, and we're not going to do that. Now, I can tell you this. One of the things that I do and then I'll get to Tutu and the other thing, okay? Tutu and the Passion Play. One of the things that I do in Rome as the head of the John Paul II Center is we give 10 scholarships a year to the very, very best students. In fact, one of the students from here.
Yeah, one of our graduate students
One of your
in
graduate
theology
students is
currently
now one of the fellows. And what we do is we take those mostly Catholic students. We had one Jewish student, but mostly one Muslim. We had mostly Catholic students. And we teach them about interreligious dialogue, okay? We also bring them for 2 weeks to Israel. Now, what is interesting is we've taken the very top people in the Catholic Church, given them PhDs, given them licenses, we give them a certificate. They go and they teach all over the world. And what do they do? In those situations where they see either Israel or the Jewish people being criticized without any real justification, like Tutu, I'll go into Tutu in a minute, they stand up and they say, look, it's not true. What you're talking about, Israel, is not true. I was there. I was there for 2 weeks. And what you're saying, look, there are a lot of things in Israel that I may not like or you may not like that nobody likes. That's not the point. Name one country that doesn't have some things that nobody likes. But I can tell you, now, look, here's the point. What have I done in my work? Let me just put it in 2 sentences. I don't think it's right that Jews have to be the only ones to defend Judaism. In fact, when Kittel, you know, the word book, Kittel's word book on the Bible was translated into English, okay? The article on Pharisees was an atrocity because that book was written during the Nazi period, in the 30s, okay? So Hans Jonas, who was my teacher and great mentor and friend, said, Jack, would you mind writing because I do first century, I teach first century Judaism in Rome, would you mind doing the article on the Pharisees and make it right because what it is an atrocity? And I said, no. I said, it's a Christian that wrote it. Let a Christian write on the Pharisees. In other words, why is it that only Jews have to be the ones to defend Judaism? Why is it the Jews have to be the ones to defend Israel? Let our scholars, let our students, let the people we give scholarships to, let them be the ones, with all honesty and with all integrity, say, I'm sorry, what you're saying is simply not true. It's propaganda. This has happened over and over and over again. We now have students all over the world. We have now Taras, who is doing a brilliant job in Lvov, and he keeps a record of all of the students that have been graduated. We've done this for 5 years. We have over 60 students who are all over, and each year we're doing 10 more each year. And now that is very important, because by doing that, we're having Christians standing up for Jews, Judaism, Israel, in a way that I think it makes them pop, because they're invited. I wouldn't be invited, okay? That's your first question. Second question, Tutu. I'll have to send you an article that I wrote called Too Much. I mean, I think the man is a disaster. In fact, he invited me to go to India for this reconciliation commission, okay? I don't even know where to begin. What you had is one guy who was totally tortured and horrible, and he says, I forgive the people who tortured me, you know? Then there was another guy who did the torturing, he says, oh, well, I did the torturing, and, you know, it wasn't a great thing for me to do, and then they embraced. I said, I'm sorry, you can't level and put them both on the same. I can understand the person who did the torturing saying, you know, this was a horrible thing, how do I live with myself, and so forth. But to just glibly say these things, and the poor person who's been tortured, I said, I'm sorry. There's an element of justice here. Tutu has no sense of that. He came, by the way, to Ramapo College, and Russ Berry at that time was alive, and he brought me to a dinner. And he got up and he said to Tutu, we were at the same table, and he says, this is my rabbi, and he tells me you're an anti-Semite. Tutu looked at me with total, who is this guy, you know? He says, no, I'm not an anti-Semite. He said, well, if my rabbi says you're an anti-Semite, you're an anti-Semite. That's what Russ Berry said. And I sat down with Tutu, and I said, look, you know, we're just living in two different worlds. You're dealing with a man who basically doesn't know what he's talking about. And the Nobel Peace Prize now means very little, okay? So much for Tutu. Now, with respect to the Passion Play. Look, I really think that it's very important for us to raise that issue. I think it's important for us to raise that issue. The real problem is, what are the conditions within which you're going to raise that issue, okay? Now, there are two other issues that I felt have to be raised. The first is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Because you know that the protocols are in 14 Arab dialects. We have on Antepli, you can go online and you could see it. He got up at Seton Hall. You could look at his talk at Seton Hall after he came back from Auschwitz. We bring imams and rabbis to Auschwitz and Dachau. The first time that I brought imams to Auschwitz in 2011, I was attacked by the Jewish community. Why are you bringing Holocaust deniers to Auschwitz? I said, what should I bring? Those that don't deny the Holocaust? Let them look with their eyes and see what they're, you know, and then see. And we've had Holocaust deniers coming back and saying, condemning anti-Semitism and condemning Holocaust denial. We had Imam Magid getting on Al Jazeera for an hour in Arabic saying, none of my followers should either buy, read, or sell the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. So that's one thing. The Passion Play is another thing. Now, what I'm working on right now is to bring about between 400 and 500 rabbis to Rome to meet with the Pope and to say to the Pope the following, just as four things. One, we want to thank the Pope for everything that's happened in the Catholic community for reconciliation with the Jews. That's the first thing. Secondly, this is our understanding of what has happened. And I've written that section, which is a lot more detailed than what I've said today. It's an analysis of the documents, indicating what the documents are. Thirdly, after giving here is what we How we look at Christians. We talked about, as I said tonight, the righteous of all nations have a place in the world to come. Mipnei darkei shalom, for the sake of peace. The Noahide laws, which says basically that there's a universal principle. And then finally, what we want to do is to ask him to come out with a papal letter on Jews and Judaism. We feel that we have an opportunity with this Pope in a way that we haven't in the past for the following reasons. He's the only Pope to have written a book with a rabbi, right? When he was in his country, for Yom HaShoah, he would light a candle. When the Jewish center in Buenos Aires was bombed, he went and personally helped clean it up. And he has gotten up and said, you cannot be a Catholic and be an anti-Semite. And you've got here an opportunity. By the way, we've been working with Cardinal Dolan on this. So what we're doing is trying to bring at least 400 to 500 rabbis to Rome with this statement, with the hope. Now, my hope is that in his response, he will be able to condemn the protocols, condemn the way the Passion Plays work, condemn all acts of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. But this thing has to be worked on. It's not something that can be actually done without the proper background and without the proper. The good thing in the work that I do that I think is the most important thing is that I have never taken credit for anything. Never. Because the mistake, there are two mistakes. The first mistake is to go and rush to the press. I never wanted to be in the press. Because if you take credit for it, then they didn't do it. And if they didn't do it, then it doesn't mean anything. Just recently, something happened that I found very upsetting because I've been working very hard with the Orthodox Christian community. If you look at the prayers for Holy Week in the Orthodox Christian community, they're the most anti-Semitic things you can possibly read. Just recently, a person who's been very active in Catholic Dialog, Jewish, was at this recent meeting with the Orthodox, and I thought he made a really basic blunder, because here's what he did. He got up, and towards the end of the conference, when everybody was more or less, being fairly nice to one another, that was the first stage. Remember I said the first stage was, let's be nice, let's all have cake? He got up and he said, look, I don't want to let this conference go without saying the following. Can't you Orthodox do what the Catholics did and not hold the Jews guilty for collective guilt with respect to the death of Jesus? There was nothing but total silence, and the whole thing broke up in a very negative way. Now, what was the mistake that he made? It's a mistake that, if you know anything about this kind of work, you don't make. The first thing is you don't say these things publicly. You have to say things privately. And if a Jew asks you to do it, then they won't do it because they're saying we're being bribed, we're being cajoled, we're being forced by the Jews to do it. It has to come from them. You can go behind the scenes. I can tell you, behind the scenes, I went to Cardinal Willebrand, I went to Cardinal Cassidy, I went to a lot of them on a number of issues, dealing with a lot of issues. There's no reason for me to go into it because I don't want to take credit for it, okay? But it has to come from them, and it cannot be done publicly. It has to be done between. Now, here's the approach. It's the only one that I know that works. You have to go to the person who has the authority, convince that person to do it, show him why it can be done, and help him do it, and don't take any credit for it at all. Then you're going to get something done. Listen, thank you very, very much. This has been...
Thanks, everyone, for turning out this evening. If you haven't already signed in, we have sign-up sheets at the entrance here, the exit, whatever it is. If you'd like to give us your email address and name, we can keep you updated on future events. And again, our next event will be on April 4th.